Hello, everyone, and welcome to MuniciPality, a podcast exploring the wonders of local government through discussions and special guests. Today, we have with us Matthew, Adrian, Natalia, Kylie, and myself, Sam. To learn more about us, check out our first mini episode called Meet the Neighbors. But now, we want to welcome you to the neighborhood with our very first topic. Today, we're talking about the reactions of local government to COVID-19 in COVID-19 and local government, hometown and college town responses. So the first conversation for today centers around this idea of balance. Because of COVID-19, community members and their local governments are needing to weigh brand new ideas and considerations to hopefully find a balance between many different things: mental and physical health of community members, the economic interests of businesses in the area, public safety, just to name a few. So our first question is, what is the best way to strike a balance between supporting local businesses and public health during this time? And specifically, how do college students play into that balance by being on campus?
Well, that is an excellent question. I mean, if you look into the CARES Act, a lot of the money that is going and that's been allocated from the federal government is going to corporations using a trickle-down economics theory, which, if you just look at it historically, doesn't always work. But there are some loans that small businesses can apply for, potentially acquire. But the problem with loans is you'll eventually have to pay them back, so it doesn't necessarily mitigate the issue. So I think one of the best ways to support local businesses would be there's local restaurant getting takeout. That's an easy thing you can do even during the pandemic. In terms of public health, I think there's been a quite big divide in the business community that they want to reopen, right? Because they need to for their livelihood. But is that a problem for public health? So I think that kind of the best way to balance that from a policy perspective is say, okay, how can we reopen to the best of our ability, but also maintain the proper health standards? So does that mean there's a requirement for the amount of people that can be in the building at a time? How many workers can you have employed? Are there PPE equipment provided by, is that something provided by the business, or is that something that the county or even the state is going to be providing? So I think from that policy perspective, there's so many different avenues you can go to. But for a college student, I think the best thing you can do is, if you are at a local business, if you're at a restaurant, a lot of retail businesses are starting to reopen. Be mindful of the employees who are working and their health. Keep distance. Try not to go in large groups, but also be patient. Not the whole menu or the whole selection at a store is probably going to be available. So kind of make do. But I think it's really important that you can use also your social media presence if there is a small business that's struggling, to support them and amplify their message.
No, I would absolutely agree. And just the one thing I wanted to add to that is one of the things I've really liked seeing come out of Madison during this time is there's been a lot of I believe I saw a website where they had a list of the Venmo accounts of a bunch of different waiters and waitresses that work in the area that aren't able to work during the pandemic, and so people could just send them, even if it's just a couple dollars. It helps, honestly. And I've seen people comment underneath people posting about it, saying thank you, and things like that. Kylie, I believe you said you had something to say about that.
Yeah, so I had a really interesting experience with this even back in March when I was leaving my college campus. And I think it has to do with the fact that people sometimes believe, like, oh, all businesses are kind of being impacted in the same ways with this, and they're all struggling and that sort of thing. And one thing that happened in my college town, it's a kind of small area. So this seems like a silly example, but there's several different liquor stores in the area. And some of them, their business just tanked because certain like subdivisions or certain areas of town just were completely evacuated because all the students were leaving. But then other stores actually saw their business increase after the first set of stores were closing, and then the business shifted to these stores. And that was before we really had all of the information about PPE and that kind of thing. So then those stores were struggling to meet the higher demand, struggling to keep like more workers working actually because they needed to. And it just kind of created like this divide where people had either no business or like more business than they knew what to do with safely. So I guess it really needs to be taken on a business to business level to address it properly, in my opinion. And I understand that's really hard to do.
I was going to also add, like, my university where I go, George Washington University in DC, we don't have dining halls, which I know is very strange. And so how our dining system works is that you have like an allotted amount of money on your ID card, and then you go to restaurants on campus. So we have tons of local restaurants and food trucks on campus. Before I left, a bunch of my friends in Sunrise actually gathered a lot of money to give to one of these food trucks specifically because basically their business is surrounded by these university students because they like pay money to basically be hooked up to the GW like money system of like what students can buy. And so after like we all left, obviously a lot of those businesses in our buildings in like around campus were really supported by students where they had a limited choice of these restaurants to support. And so a lot of like the businesses around the university are really excited for students to come back because the majority of their income comes from these students. And so I think that's like an important balance, like to make sure that these businesses are supported, but at the same time, like obviously they cannot be filled to the same capacity as before. Or maybe food trucks won't be allowed because like we had a lot of food trucks on campus and that obviously brings big crowds. So it's interesting to try to find this balance specifically in the situation that I experienced. But like something easy like to do to make businesses like a little bit safer is just to wear a mask, even though they say that like it's not like a super big issue if you're outside or something like that, but like it's a little thing that to me when I see someone wear a mask it shows that they respect my health and well-being. And so I know that there's a lot of like not controversy but people feeling like it's infringing upon their choice, which is understandable, but during this time, this would allow businesses to maybe open at a larger capacity if people were able to limit in some way through a mask their ability to spread the disease to others and allow that the business continues to support workers, but also allows, businesses to continue.
Yeah, and not to go too much into this, but that's really the exact same experience in the college town, quote unquote, region of the city in which I go to school. Like I said, it's a really small community. And a lot of the businesses in that area already are scheduled to shut down during the summer months each year. So then like even one semester of students not being on campus or not fully on campus puts them like not operational for over half of the year. So it just becomes a very difficult problem for those businesses, especially because I know a lot of the federal aid that's being administered has like a week limit on it or a month limit on it. So it's not enough for them to receive that because it does not cover the full length of time that they're really out of operation.
Yeah, I'll just speak briefly to one of the industries that I guess is not talked about a lot in the discussion about like small businesses that are struggling due to COVID and stuff. My dad works for a company that has a factory outside Minneapolis, and they've been able to continue operating basically through the entire time that stuff has been shut down, because they're not like a customer-facing business. It's all just the employees working in the factory. And for them, it was initially having way fewer people in, and now it's keeping all the employees in and paid and still hired thanks to federal loans that the company's gotten. But then also having everyone wear PPE and stay 6 feet apart from each other, which, at least in my view, seems like it would be very arduous for folks to maintain their mental health when they're working like a 12-hour shift and can't go within 6 feet of their coworkers. But that's just another aspect of something that I think is just really important for them to be able to keep the business open, especially since they're making supplies for PPE like plastic face masks and things like that. So it's definitely been interesting for them too. Like Kylie was saying, how some businesses have been impacted in different ways than others. Like my dad's company has in some ways had success because it had more business for producing PPE, but then at the same time, they've had other contracts that haven't been able to go through because other aspects of the economy are kind of tanking right now. So people are not doing other projects that they would be, and thus relying on the factory in that aspect. So they've been able to stay at full employment because of the federal loans. But it's definitely still impacting business around here differently. And I'll add another thing. I'm a little bit like personally afraid of all of the opening that's happening in Minnesota right now. I see people going to the businesses and restaurants in my town, and also when I was in Madison a few weeks ago. And in theory, yes, everyone's staying far enough apart, and people are trying to follow the social distancing guidelines and stuff. But I think that in practice, people are not going to follow them to the extent that they need to in order to keep folks safe. So I'll echo what a lot of y'all have said earlier, that people need to make a concerted effort when they go out to protect their health and others in their community. Matthew, you had a hand up a while ago. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, just kind of going off of that, I think also the discussion when talking about small businesses or even larger businesses in general should kind of look at the employees, because they're also the people who are hurting in some of these businesses due to, federal loans, CARES Act. They've been able to stay afloat, right? But that has come at the expense of many of the employees. Like I personally know many people who've been furloughed or were just outright laid off. And what has been happening in many ways is they're doing it for obviously profits for a lot of these businesses, but also these workers are expendable. And I think that when looking at the funding that's going to businesses, I think that's very important, but I think a wider discussion needs to be had that rather than play by the idea that the money from the CARES Act is going to go to business, which is then going to go into said workers' hands, why not just put the money directly into the workers' hands as like a straight up stimulus check on top of what's already been provided? And I think that could potentially help more workers, and then as such, the business would not have to pay them or even lay them off in the first place. And then my last point, kind of speaking on what Adrian was saying about people not necessarily following public health orders. I was on a run on Thousand Oaks Boulevard like 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago, which is the main street in my city. And I ran by this bar and it was filled with like 150 people out front. Nobody was wearing masks. People were smoking. And like normally that's okay. But during a pandemic, to me, it seems like that is a bit irresponsible. And if those actions continue, I don't see us getting out of this anytime soon.
I was also going to add again that like we talk about the balance between like in this question specifically like business and public health, but like an aspect of public health that people really don't talk about is like mental health during this time, because specifically like the WHO put loneliness as one of the biggest problems facing humanity right now, and I can't imagine the repercussions to all of this. Like I think about my grandmother, she's like 80 something, living in an apartment by herself in Argentina. My uncle does news reporting in Argentina. And so he's not able to see her obviously because he's in high contact. And so I think about the implications of that and trying to strike a balance, because obviously social distancing is really, really important. But at the same time, for people's psychological health, it's important to see friends, significant others, family, and like some sort of balance. And so I understand why people are, now that like stuff has been lifted a little bit, started kind of acting like the pandemic's over and kind of clawing for a sense of normalcy. And I think it's a very innately human behavior. And so it's like, I don't think it should be necessarily punished, but there needs to be kind of a scale back where we can find more of a middle ground and a balance where people can go into a restaurant normally and support maybe local businesses, but there has to be other precautions taken so that all aspects, economic, mental health, and like physical health can all be, done in a way that actually, promotes like that benefits the communities and the individuals.
No, that's absolutely true. And the one thing I wanted to add to that is that's one of the nice things about living in the day and age that we do is that we have this access to technology that allows us to, FaceTime a friend or, use whatever program that you like to use, Skype or whatever. We actually have access to technology that allows us to talk to our friends and our family at long distances. But of course, that creates a barrier for people that wouldn't be able to afford that. And then the last thing, I don't want to beat this question to death because we do have more, but I wanted to add one perspective to the striking a balance conversation, because my family actually owns a restaurant. They just opened a restaurant about 7 months ago. So, several months before the pandemic broke out. And they actually stayed open the whole time, kept their employees on and everything. And the few ways that they did that is, even though we didn't offer it at first, obviously carry out is a big one, but we just turned our, who are normally our waitresses and our waiters into delivery drivers, so they could drive deliveries and whatnot. And then later, as time went on, the city decided to allow putting like picnic tables outside of our restaurant. So instead of the couple parking spots that we have there, they actually replaced it with some picnic tables, and people have come with their family to just sit out there. Their tables are 6 feet apart. So I just wanted to add, that's one safe way that the city that I'm from, it's in Illinois, is able to, kind of figure that out. But I do want to move on to the next question, and that's, we were talking, amongst ourselves before recording about these spotlight cities, kind of the best responses by local governments. And I know Matthew had some really good examples. So Matthew, I'll turn to you about some of the spotlight cities or the cities who have had the best responses to this pandemic.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, so I think really one of the best cities to look at here is the city of Los Angeles. It's a city with just over 4 million people. It's in a county of 10 million people, which is 2 times the size of the entire state of Wisconsin. So when we're talking about a pandemic and a place with tons of people, it's a perfect example. And a couple times I've mentioned the CARES Act, and not only is there aid for people, for businesses, but there's also a specific element for public services, which has been really crucial for navigating the pandemic. So a total of $5 billion was allocated specifically to local governments in the CARES Act. And unlike most entitlements, the entire $5 billion can be used specifically on public services. And it varies, whether from rent payment assistance, pop-up emergency shelters for homelessness, facility leases, or pretty much like any other community needs. And the previous law's 15% cap on the amount of the grant is generally obligated for public services, but since it does not apply to this or prior fiscal year 19 or fiscal year 20 CDBG funding, CDBG funding is community development block grant funding, just in case. We can go into that in another episode, but really, of the $5 billion, at least $2 billion is spent specifically on community development block grants, which every community has its own requirement for this funding. But the general idea with the CARES Act is about $1 billion of this is allocated directly to communities' needs, and the other $2 billion is on a rolling basis by HUD. And really, I think this is vital because the city of Los Angeles has implemented many programs, many of which have actually been really ramped up due to COVID-19. So Project Room Key is a program that the city has been running in collaboration with the Housing Authority and all these other avenues. And what Project Room Key is it's a method where, there's a lot of motels and hotels throughout the city right now that are not being occupied, right, because of COVID. So with Project Room Key, the city is partnering and signing on to, say, a 6-month lease, right, so we can temporarily house people who are homeless. The city has a homeless population of 36,000 people, 6,000 of which are children. So it's really that's the most vulnerable population when we're talking about who could get COVID. And then finally, don't want to go on too long, but there's an emergency shelters program we are running through the Recreation and Parks District. So on land that is owned by the city or that we lease directly, that we have pop-up trailer sites. So we have had many fires in the past few years, and the firefighters would stay in these trailers. So we're basically, I think we pay 25%, the state pays 75%, reimburses it through FEMA, has all these trailer sites so we can house a lot of families. So you got to think outside the box and really innovative when you have so many people who are impacted by this.
Yeah, it is absolutely true. And I'm, obviously you're in LA, I'm not. So it's very interesting to hear about all that. I actually really like the route that they're going. I do like the idea of, taking businesses that already exist and using them to help the community during this difficult time. So I do find that really interesting. The next question that I wanted to ask, and this is for everyone in the or all of our hosts rather, is how well are the local governments of the cities you're living in handling COVID-19? I think we said we were going to start with Natalia.
Yeah, I think obviously I have kind of two experiences in the town that I'm currently living in Edina, Minnesota, which is a suburb outside of Minneapolis, and then the experience that I know friends who are still living in DC where I go to school. And in Edina, now that like the stay-at-home order has ended like a few weeks ago, I think that people are not super taking it seriously. Like I don't really see a lot of masks. I see people like in big groups, and especially young kids in huge groups. I think older folks are still kind of keeping to themselves, but I think at this point that like the city isn't necessarily really helping, and there's very limited testing. I think that the first time they had free testing, there was a drive-through a few weeks ago, like 2 days of the weekend, and so Minnesota had actually some of the lowest cases for a really long time. Like in the county that I live in, Hennepin County, there was like 2,000 cases for like a few weeks. I think part of that was because we didn't really have a lot of testing. The other part of that is that when I got back from university, which was probably mid-March, within 3 days, they shut down absolutely everything. Like schools, everything was completely shut down. And so Minnesota was relatively early, but the thing is, I think with the lack of testing, we didn't really know what was happening. And so we had 2,000 in Hennepin County, which is like a million, like 200,000 people. So that's really, really small. And it kind of was stagnant there. But then when we started opening up, we grew exponentially super, super quickly. And obviously, with everything that's been happening in Minnesota and the spotlight that it's under, which we will be talking about in an episode coming soon, and hopefully our next episode, and talking about George Floyd. But obviously, the protests will affect that. Not saying that I don't agree with the reasoning behind the protest, but it will affect obviously COVID in the state of Minnesota, and this is also affecting other states too now. DC is still under a stay-at-home order, and obviously DC is in a different situation because it's a larger city. It was a more international city, obviously, with people flying in, and so DC's kind of been becoming more of a hotspot now and is being hit harder. And so they're still under a stay-at-home order, but obviously with all the protests, I worry about like the health obviously of the city. But I think it's fair to say that the majority of cities kind of have been pushing their economic agenda, obviously because people are struggling right now, and in some ways has caused the cost of health, but also individuals have decided that enough is enough in some cases and have decided to forego social distancing and meet in large groups, especially evident in Minnesota at like the parks and lakes where there are just boatloads of people very close in close quarters. But I believe I saw Matthew's hand, so I'll pass it off to Matthew.
Yeah, I think this question is really interesting. And I think like local government actually, when it comes to the stay-at-home order, has a lot of power that a lot of people don't realize because, for example, in California, you first have the state's order, and then you have the county order. And then if the city wants to make an order, that's possible. And interestingly enough, you can't make your order any less strict than the one that's higher up, but you can make it more strict. So let's say the California order was like super lax. If the city of Thousand Oaks, where I currently reside, wanted to make a super strict order, they theoretically could. There might be some stipulations in the general ordinance with the county, but generally speaking, they could. And I have felt very lucky to live in this state because our governor, Gavin Newsom, really took this head on at the beginning, and there was a pretty strict way of doing this. And there was a 4-pronged stages that was released after the stay-at-home order was first issued on March 19th. The first stage was about safety and preparing, making sure there's enough PPE equipment, making sure people change their behavior, changing the flow of the physical workplace. And then phase 2, which we've currently entered in, is the opening of lower risk workplaces, retail, outdoor museums, offices, limited personnel services. And then there's a criteria for restaurants to open. And then stage 3 goes to higher risk workplaces. And then stage 4 is the end of the stay-at-home order. But generally speaking, the city of Los Angeles has been pretty strict. All the parks and trails, beaches, all of that was shut down throughout the entire county, much to the ire of some people. But all of it was shut down. If you were to go out, like walk your dog, you had to wear a mask. Even if you were running, even if you went on a run, you theoretically in Los Angeles County would have to wear a mask. So things were definitely taken pretty seriously. And there were a few, I don't want to say alt-right protests, but there are a few folk who were upset about their constitutional rights. They thought that arming themselves and going to public buildings was a smart idea, which I don't want to get too panini here. But anyway, so so LA has done a good job with the response, and I think it's really shown the role of the county and the public health officer in all sorts of these elements and kind of how they can work together and handle this whole response.
Yeah, Matthew, I'm really glad to hear that California is working on all that stuff. Minnesota is about to begin our stage 3 of reopening. I was initially really pleased with Minnesota's shutting down in the beginning and doing a pretty good job with social distancing and keeping business closed. Obviously, it was a hard hit for some people, and there were folks in Minnesota, like Matthew was alluding to, that were upset about the social distancing and shutting down everything and protested that. So it's definitely not something that everyone loved in the beginning, but I was a fan of it for like the swift response in Minnesota. And now our stage 3 that's happening right now is that restaurants can continue or can begin to offer indoor dining now, and as long as they maintain social distancing and have no more than 50% capacity. Basically, a bunch of other places, like almost everything, is going to be able to be open now at like about 25% capacity, something like that. And I'm honestly not very excited for what is going to happen as a result of that, because the recommendation is that folks can open for like indoor dining or indoor activities, and that they should still be practicing social distancing and wearing a mask when they're outside or in public places and washing their hands. But obviously, people aren't going to do that all the time. And they also, the guideline is also like if you feel sick, you should get tested immediately and you should stay home, etc. But people don't always feel sick when they have COVID. So we'll see how this goes. I am hopeful that it'll turn out okay. But also given all the protests that have been happening in Minneapolis and the surrounding areas lately as a result of the death and police violence around George Floyd, I think that we'll be seeing in a few weeks some more cases. So I'm just glad that we took the steps that we did initially to keep the state safe in Minnesota, and so that the hospitals and our infrastructure are prepared for when this kind of secondary and third bumps happen. I'll make one more comment about mostly in Minneapolis itself. Like Natty was alluding to earlier, the lakes are just crowded all the time and people are not properly socially distancing. I'm glad to hear that in LA people have to wear masks when they were running, but people were definitely not wearing masks when they were running in Minneapolis. And I honestly felt unsafe biking without a mask at times when I was in Madison in the past few weeks, because the paths there were also super busy. So I support that like the paths and everything are open for folks to enjoy the outdoors right now, but it's probably not safe in the way that it has been done. But I guess time will tell what strategies actually ended up working out the best. And okay, one more point I want to make, and then I'll let the other folks jump in here. But in my town, we talked about a curfew a bit before we started recording this episode. And in my town, Edina, we had a curfew for a few days as a result of the protests in Minneapolis. And Natty and I kind of thought that was ironic, given that the city was kind of ineffective at shutting down outdoor activities due to the pandemic. But the minute people start protesting police violence, they shut everything down and like make people stay inside after 8 p.m. So I thought that was an interesting use of a curfew by our local government.
Yeah, so Adrian, that's an interesting point that you brought up with the protests and the curfew. I've had a really different experience in my hometown about that. The extent of our protesting, and granted I'm in rural Wisconsin, but like I was saying, the extent of our protesting is a couple people standing outside the police station. But I did really relate to what you were saying about both the restaurants and the parks again. So I was actually at a state park about 10 minutes from my hometown this morning. I was just sitting at a picnic table, like under a tree by myself, doing some work for my job. And I was looking over at the beach, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of people with no social distancing and no masks whatsoever. So after I finished my work, I was really torn on whether I wanted to go for a hike or not. And I decided to go for it, but I was going to put on my mask and that sort of thing. And then I finished my hike, I started coming home. And this sounds so silly, but I really, really wanted to stop at Culver's, which is a very Midwestern small business. Well, not small business, but they're typically like franchise employee owned, that kind of thing. And I really wanted to stop. But then this is where my experience from my major really took over for me. And I said, there's no required paid sick leave in the United States. And this sounds so unrelated, but I was thinking that. And then I was like, if I was a minimum wage worker, I would probably still go to work, even if I was sick. And then I said, my chicken tenders can wait. I don't want to make them wait, but they're going to. So then I just drove home. And actually, the one other experience I've had with Culver's this quarantine is also very relevant, because the last time I've had Culver's was the day that I was training to work Wisconsin's April 7th election, which I'm sure some people have heard about. It did not get canceled, though it should have been, and though dozens of other states canceled their primaries at similar times. I am an election poll worker, and we had to do some trainings in person as well as the actual election in person. And my manager went and got us Culver's. But the real point here is that local government in my town of about 4,000 people had to deal with practically minute by minute updates for what was happening on this election. I got masks from my dad's job to bring in to give to the poll workers because there weren't any provided to us. They sent us disinfectants, but it came the day after the election, so we were luckily bought our own. Yeah, it's kind of comical, and we actually made our own like plexiglass screens or plexiglass. I don't even know what to call them. Like just windows, barricades, I don't know, between the workers and the voters out of old storm doors that we had in our shed because there was not really any funding for that. And I looked at like the little ballot tape on the voting machine at the end of the day and realized that between the absentee voters that I'd processed their ballots for and the people who came into our polling place, I had come into contact with like 700 people. And it was just ridiculous. Like I was glad that we all had masks and gloves and everything, but it was ridiculous. And the last final point on this is that being the one young person working this election, a lot of retired people, and for those of you who don't know, retired people who just need like part-time income, will typically work the elections. The chief inspector, the leader of the election site for us, is a 65-year-old woman who her and her husband are immunocompromised. So I told her, no, you're not coming into work. I'm gonna try to run this, and it probably won't be as good, but you're not coming into work. And I was also tasked, being the young person again, with communicating via Facebook group and email and that kind of thing with our community. And I think this will be a good jumping off point, but my very objective, informative posts were immediately turned into, well, if you're not willing to brave the risk and go out, then do you even really care about democracy? Or not going out is even dumber than voting for X or Y candidate. So it got politicized immediately. And I know that, or I think that that's a response that's happening in a lot of places. So yeah, I'm not sure how anyone wants to run with that, but that's the experience I had in Wisconsin.
Brought up like some really good points. And first, on the point about paid sick leave, on March 27th, 2020, the Los Angeles City Council passed an ordinance in, I think it was Council File 200147 S39, and that basically added a Chapter 20 to the Los Angeles Municipal Code, which provided supplemental paid sick leave to workers directly affected by COVID-19. So I think that's a model that could potentially be impacted during this. Also, I don't know how to turn my Facebook live notification thing off sound-wise. No, on my computer. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, so on your point about the elections, California, our governor announced a few days ago a vote by mail option for all registered voters in the state, which is an excellent thing and something that I think would be great for this country to be done holistically as a whole. And I want to say two more quick things on this note. I mentioned California earlier in this podcast was in phase 2 of the reopening. It's actually in phase 3, except 7 counties are still in phase 2 because there's a certain guidelines. Like if you have X amount of new cases, X amount of deaths, you don't qualify to move on phases. So some counties are still stuck in phase 2, some are still in phase 3 of the reopening. And then finally, I want to mention when on this point about how our local governments are dealing with it, the city of Los Angeles has done something that I think a lot of other larger municipalities could do, specifically Madison, Wisconsin, which has a huge housing shortage. They are changing the process for entitlements, construction, and technological aspects of development. So we are having a lot of our pre-development stages done virtually. A lot of the inspections that LADBS, which is part of our development and permit process, all that can occur virtually from the computer. So just imagine that, like on your computer, you can like view the site, see what's wrong with it. I think it's really cool. And then I just wanted to mention that we are revising our affordable housing incentive guidelines, which through HSID, which is the Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department, is basically updating the guidelines to make changes to state legislation, because there's been a number of really interesting affordable action projects with the density bonus. And for our listeners who don't know, a density bonus means that if a certain percentage of the units are affordable, that then the money provided by the municipality could increase. So for example, we are working on revising our density boning ordinance in Los Angeles, and it basically expands the number of on-menu incentives. So it raises the threshold to 100 units or less for like site plan review. I'll get into this in a later episode, but essentially we are having many more projects that are supportive housing, which means that if you're homeless and you need to be housed, you can go directly into a supportive housing model where you have site coordinators on hand that can provide services to you so that you can get a job and then eventually buy your own place later on. And there's a whole thing called project-based, tenant-based vouchers, which we can get into. But bottom line, what I'm trying to really emphasize here is COVID-19 has allowed a lot of the affordable housing production and supportive housing production processes to be streamlined exponentially.
I'm going to make another quick comment. Something that Kylie said about the politicizing of voting really just made me think of how politicized going out, or I guess how things have changed in terms of how people see going out and not social distancing in terms of politics. So I feel like, at least in my community, in Edina and in Minneapolis, a lot of people who would kind of identify as conservative were more pro going out and living your life per usual than people who might identify as liberal or Democrats in my community, who were more the latter folks were more inclined to like stay home more often and follow social distancing more closely. But now, in response to the widespread protests in Minneapolis and the surrounding community, a lot of people that are more like liberal or progressive identified, who are out working for police reform and abolition of the police, etc., are going out because this is what they think that they need to do, and what I think we need to do in this time, to show that despite all of the dangers to folks' health, the police are a greater danger in some cases, which is what Natalia are going to talk about in the next episode further. But I think it's just very interesting how like that's kind of shifted. Like initially going out was, I guess, exemplified by the protests in Madison of conservative folks who went out and protested the Capitol because they wanted things to open, and now that more like leftist folks are protesting and going out, the narrative has kind of changed, and conservatives are now calling for social distancing and calling for the protesters to be more aware of public health and to prioritize that over the goals of their movement.
Just a very quick thing on that, and I think you both will get into this in the next episode, but I just don't understand how some of the earlier safer at home protests had individuals bring military-grade weapons to public buildings, and there was really no pushback from that by the police and even the municipal governments in general. And then a lot of the protests now, even I've seen in local ones that I have attended, like there's a lot of attention from the whole municipal structure on these protests, and they're so concerned. And to me, the dichotomy between the two types of protests, I think, is fascinating, and I'm really excited to hear more about this.
No, absolutely. The one thing I just wanted to put on that was I was actually at the Madison protest, and there were actually some people who had full assault rifles and tac vests and everything. So they were there. I just wanted to point that out because I think a lot of people do see a lot of these protests as being politicized and, having to fall under a conservative or liberal demographic. But I think, I've heard of a lot of typically conservative people who have gone out and protested for, at Madison for the Black Lives Matter movement, and some people who were more on the liberal side who were protesting, the stay-at-home order. So, I don't want to put anything in a political box, I want to say. I obviously don't want to get into that too much either because we have a whole episode on it coming up. But I think, Natalia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was going to add also, I think something that people don't really address as much that I think is actually a big defining factor between like your perspective of the stay-at-home order is like individuals' perception of like their likelihood of being sick or being like potentially killed by the disease. I feel like young people, regardless of their political affiliation, feel like they're kind of more invincible and can go out more. Like in my town in Edina, I see hordes of young people. I do not see old people collecting in the same manner. I think even if you're a conservative older person, I think they're more cautious than perhaps a young liberal person because I think they believe that it's less likely to affect them. And so I think that's an important part of talking about like this conversation. And like even in the local protest here in my town, which is obviously close to Minneapolis, but is a small suburb, I was unable to go to the protest because my current family situation, I'm not allowed to go partake in events that are higher risk, quote unquote. And I saw videos of like armored cars. Like this was like probably like less than 1,000 people. Like there was no way that this was like a high risk situation in terms of violence or anything. Like it was a peaceful march, and there was like armored cars, and there was a lot of stuff being put out. And so I think that even in the local level, like there is a lot of money being put into, having these protests be like having police presence at these protests. So I think that's also an important aspect.
No, absolutely. And I know that we had discussed before recording that we weren't really going to get into the protests side of things because we do have an episode coming up about that. But I do want our viewers to know that obviously in a discussion about the pandemic that is still going on, when you're talking about, the stay-at-home orders and, what our local government is doing to prevent the spread, it's kind of impossible to not talk about the protests as well, because that is just a massive, massive number of people coming out and, supporting their cause. And, I'm obviously going to go neither one way nor the other about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I do have my own views on that. But, I did say before that I was at the protest, so that does kind of call me out. But, I just wanted to point out to the listeners that is something that has to be talked about at this point, because it is just such a big thing happening right now, especially within the pandemic. Matthew, I think you had something you wanted to say before we moved on back to topic.
Yeah. And I promise I won't go technical here into this point, but I think to our listeners, right, we're talking about all these things local government has done, and many may be wondering, well, how is that even happening when many people can't even work in person? So like a lot of aspects are occurring virtually over Zoom, and the city of Madison currently, ever since they combined the Committee on the Environment and the Sustainability Committee, there's now 49 city committees, including Common Council, and certain committees are meeting during the pandemic that are labeled tier 1, and then the ones that aren't tier 1 aren't meeting. So it's just been really fascinating to see how that operates. And I think it's increased accessibility for me as a student who normally could not attend all of these meetings. Now that I can just call in, speak my mind, and really participate. And I think when I mentioned tier one, it's committees of like utmost importance are kind of labeled tier one, and then it goes down from there. I haven't studied the like tier two versus tier three too closely. We can maybe explore that later on. But for example, the Plan Commission, which Adrian was actually there with me at the Madison's Plan Commission, there was a very controversial development coming forth, and we were able to just call in and say our testimony, and then one of the alders, who an alder is a city council member in the Midwest, they call them alders for some reason, but they asked a question to Adrian, and Adrian was able to answer. So it was really interesting that from our living rooms, we participated in this 7+ hour meeting about things that directly impact us that we can tangibly see. And, you know, in council meetings have been all over Zoom. In my hometown of Thousand Oaks, California, the city attorney, city clerk, city manager, and mayor all go in person to City Hall, and then the others call in via Zoom. So we even had a development that was approved in a pre-screening process, and people were able to call in and speak. And interestingly enough, in Madison, they do not let speakers have their video on, but in Thousand Oaks, they did. So just wanted to share. And even with my current internship in the mayor's office for Los Angeles, I have only met in person one person there. Everyone else, I've just done it. I've met them through Zoom, and I now have legitimate relationships with people that I've never actually met in person. And like, I was at the housing committee the other day, listening to city council. I mean, it's truly amazing if you think about it, that local government, you know, the beauty of local government is it always has to happen. A pandemic, it's not like a business that government can, or the government will stop because of some event. It's required to continue.
Yeah, I think I'll echo Matthew, and I'm glad you mentioned that that city planning commission in Madison. That was a really interesting experience. I mean, we were on effectively a 6-hour plus meeting, and kind of doing a lot of technical maneuvers in order to try to stop this development that we were opposed to. And there's no way that us and the other students who were on that call would have been able to all stay there for a 6-hour meeting if it was in person. And also just to be able to have all the resources that we did and to do the digital organizing that we were able to do to get the around 2,000 signatures on our petition. I think that all of that was able to happen because of the availability of information online, and frankly, some of that has happened because of COVID. So that's definitely very interesting. And I hope that local governments and even other institutions will continue to kind of keep in mind the accessibility of things online in the future, so that people can just be able to be more involved in the local government and decision making at every level. Because if you can have online meetings like this, like now we know this is possible, so now there's no longer the excuse for basically closed door meetings when they should be able to be streaming them all the time. So anyway, yeah, and I just wanted to say another thing about Madison protests, I guess, in particular. Obviously, I'm very close to Minneapolis protests in general, but when I was in Madison, I was, and I believe still, there are nightly protests during the curfew that are against police brutality there, that I will say I am strongly in favor of. I think that given the brutality by the police against the generally peaceful protesters that I've seen and heard about, and know people personally who've experienced it, I think that it's justified for folks to continue to keep going out, even despite the risks that there are now. And from the one protest that I did go to in Minneapolis, I will say it was one of the more like physically comfortable protests to go to that I've been to, I believe, because people were making a good effort to stay socially distanced, and people probably weren't 6 feet away from each other all the time, but nobody was like touching and up against each other like folks are usually at protests or big rallies, things like that. So it was actually like a pretty accessible protest in terms of like folks that would have disabilities related to mobility, or anybody that was needing medical attention or food or healthcare at any time. It was a really like relatively physically accessible protest and experience. So obviously it's still going to be scary, but I think it's not a bad way to protest. And we'll get more into this, I'm sure, in the future. But yeah, I definitely think that the work that is being motivated by these protests in Minneapolis is justified and worthy.
I was going to add something quick in like my personal experience, though this is not like local politics, but in the activism space that I'm involved in Sunrise and like my university specifically, we have like elections for our government SA, and the Sunrise put on a referendum question of like, would you want the Board of Trustees to divest from fossil fuels at their whatever, I think it was like May something meeting, I forget which day it was, but basically we passed that. We had higher voter turnout in universities or in our university election than we'd ever had. We passed that referendum with 85.6% of the student body. And so I think it's actually interesting that now I feel like people are becoming more involved weirdly now that we're at a distance, and especially young people. Like technology in this way has made it more accessible to be involved in every aspect of either government or, at a university kind of level thing. And it's interesting because people are taking really interest to that. And people, I think that's also kind of reflected in George Floyd, that people post things like, call this local person. I feel like before now, people would have not done that in the same capacity that people have been turning out to call for people, because people are at home and obviously have less things to do in some cases. And obviously they feel like they can help through this, but also I think people are now seeing more so the power of local government. And so I was just going to add that bit. Kylie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up about divestment, and specifically how it's happening while we're all off campus. So Cornell, which is where I go to school, also made big progress on divestment while none of us were on campus. It came out in the daily newspaper, some updates about it in the last couple of weeks. And yeah, I really agree with what you said there about students just having access more, especially now that our semester ended. Even the remote classes have ended for the summer. I think that students are looking for ways to be connected with their campuses, and whether that's activism or the more traditional student organizations or whatever that is. And I think that interest is coming specifically because we kind of we had to skip out on a couple of months of our regular semester where we would normally see that interest. So we're kind of finding ways to make up for it, in my opinion. And I guess that brings me to something that we had planned on talking about right before we wrap up today's episode. And that's kind of our own personal plans for going back to campus or living on campus or living in our campus communities, even to relate to government. Are those plans changing for next semester? And I know that for me, they for sure are. I was doing some journaling this morning, actually, and basically all of my plans or my options, my plan A, plan B, plan C for next semester, none of them really personally involve going back to campus for me. I am choosing to take classes remotely, either through my university, Cornell if they offer them, or trying to get transfer credits for another university and just transfer them into Cornell, because I'm going from a really low risk area to Ithaca, New York, which is not a great big community, but our medical resources in terms of ventilators and hospital beds are just not very sufficient for the big student population. So that just is one tiny example, i.e. my life, of how students are going to continue changing where their dollars are spent and changing where their votes are cast as a result of this. So I'd be curious to kind of see before we wrap up if anyone else is thinking ahead to next semester, or what your plans are for where you're going to live, where you're going to go to school, and that kind of thing.
I would also agree with Kylie that I feel like I'm in kind of a rough situation because I'm obviously in a lower risk area. I would be going back to DC, which is kind of spiking at the moment, but also we have 15,000 undergrad students in essentially a few blocks radius kind of thing. And so 15,000 undergrad, that doesn't include professors, faculty, maintenance workers. That doesn't include our grad students. That doesn't include the law school. And GW is an open campus, and so I see business people walking through campus all the time. And they announced a few days ago that officially we're going back on August 31st as we initially planned, and that we're not going to have breaks. But to me, and we're going to have finals online, but to me it's very scary because I remember I crunched the numbers really at the beginning of this. Even if like no one's immune compromised, just the random numbers of young people, like it's still hundreds of people potentially dying if everyone gets it. And that doesn't include immune compromise, and that doesn't include a lot of things. And so it's very scary because I so deeply want to go back to campus because I think I'm in a position where I'm going to have to continue with schooling, whatever GW allows me to do. And so it's very scary to think that in 3 months' time, like right now, I don't see anyone outside of my family within 6 feet, but in 3 months, I will be on a plane heading to a city with like millions more people, basically, and potentially exposing myself. But also, I wonder, is it worth it for a lot of students, even if they have it open, to even, they talk about limited time in classes or limited time outside. Is it worth it to go back to university if you're allowed to go to class once or twice a week for a specific class? Or is it worth it if you can't be involved in your groups? And so I think a lot of us are battling this question. I think a lot of people are just kind of going to go regardless because they miss it so much. Obviously, it's a big change for a lot of university students to come back with their parents. But I don't have an answer. I just have been really worried about it because to me, I can't fathom a way that my university would be able to do things safely. And it feels like a lot of universities are pushed to open up, not because it's the right choice, but because of financial reasonings. I talked about the restaurants in my community. Those restaurants need to be open or else GW has to financially support them because when we come back, they can't just be like, oh, all the restaurants closed. Like, we don't have food for you. There has to be steps to be like done by the university. And so I feel like the push for a lot of universities right now to open up is because of financials and worried about tuition loss and all of those things. And so I'd hope that health would be the top priority, but I think it's not going to be perfect. And I think hopefully they'll come out with more plans, but I don't know. I don't have an answer, but.
Yeah, my thoughts about students going back is that you can always try to do whatever you're going to do to keep folks distance in the classroom, but obviously the university experience is not just in the classroom. And it means partying, and it means organizations, and it means folks just going around on State Street in Madison and the quads of universities everywhere again. So that's what I think I'm most concerned for when universities go back. And at least what it seems like is going to happen in Madison now is some kind of like blended model where folks come back for some amount of in-person classes, some amount of online classes. Like Natty was talking about, that's obviously a different academic experience, and is that worth it? That can be debated, obviously. But for me personally, I have already been planning to take basically this entire academic year off of school. I'm going to be working this summer and fall on a campaign, so I won't personally be affected by that at like the university level. But obviously, campaigning is very different under COVID, so it's going to be interesting, and I'm sure I'll keep folks on this podcast up to date with how that goes. But obviously, all of y'all have more opinions to share about that, so I will leave it at that.
Yeah, just a very quick point on that. I think basically this will be talked about in another episode, but we are planning to make a campus neighborhood association to advocate for many of these measures come next year. And because rent and like landlords are not always being the most fair, we can get into that.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing before we wrap up the episode. And that's that, as I said in the first episode, I quarantined back home in rural Wisconsin for 2 months before I decided to come back to Madison. And I figured, after 2 months, while, things were obviously still dangerous and, I didn't want to be going out a lot. I obviously need to work. I need to pay rent. I have a place out here. So, my decision to come back was Wisconsin had started opening up. I figured it'd be fine. And with the protests that have started, I'm not sure what we'll see. I saw a lot of people wearing masks. So that does give me, actually, I'm pretty sure everyone had a mask, especially because, there were some organizations that were there that were handing out masks and gloves, which was really awesome. I was really glad to see that. But I am a little worried, having been there as well, and being surrounded by, I think there was like 2,000 people there. It was really, really awesome to see, actually. It does worry me having that many people. But I think that I've been living off campus. I'm going into my junior year, as I said before, so I won't be living on campus next semester. But honestly, I haven't even enrolled in my classes quite yet for next semester because I'm not entirely sure what my plan is. I know the rumors that I had heard, and I'm sure they're just rumors, is that larger lectures that will be taking place, starting next semester are going to be done online, and then discussions are meant to be done in person. Obviously, like I said, those are only rumors. And if everything ends up being online, I'm not sure if, I want to take a year off and maybe work. College is expensive. And, some people are privileged enough to, have that taken care of. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those people. So I'm not entirely sure what my plan is. But, I'll probably end up in Madison one way or the other, just because I do love this city and I love the university and I'd like to stay close to it. But I believe that's all we're going to discuss today. So thank you, audience, very much for listening to our first roundtable discussion today, where we discuss the intersection between schools and universities in our local communities, local government, as well as local businesses, all in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges it's brought about. We also dipped our toe into next week's topic about the protests. But, we really hope you enjoyed this episode, and we encourage you to reach out to us and share your thoughts or even ask a follow-up question or two. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at MuniciPality with 2 underscores. As we talked about throughout the episode. For next week's episode, we're going to have Adrian and Natalia talking about a very difficult, nuanced topic, and that's going to be the history and future of policing in the United States. So thank you very much for stopping by this week, and we hope to see you again soon in our municipality.